Although the Vietnam War is often romanticized in American movies, the reality was much harsher. In a previous video, we briefly covered the war's historical background, but now we'll delve deeper into the topic. Would you like to learn about Project 100, which is considered one of the most shameful events in American history? Or about the high rates of drug use among soldiers in Vietnam, and how they felt about the war? That's what we'll be exploring in the next few minutes with the help of our special guest. This video is brought to you by Thorum. Take a look at this rings. They have rings made from 4 billion-year-old Gibeon meteorite and genuine 65 million-year-old T-Rex bone. If you are a fan of Vikings, they have Odin ring, the Norse god of war, the Thor ring, and all of them are crafted by hand. Head the link in the comments and use promo code LIVINGHISTORY to get 20% off a truly unique ring. Let's meet James Brown. It's March 1968 and the Vietnam War is raging at its peak. Brown has been on the front lines for 4 months, and even though he is a private, he outranks some officers due to his experience. In Vietnam, experience counted for more than just rank and combat skills. Soldiers expected to fight the enemy face to face, but the reality was much different. Trench warfare, ambushes, and Viet Cong hiding in trees were just some of the challenges soldiers faced. These challenges, coupled with the fact that most recruits were not adequately prepared, drove many soldiers to the brink of insanity. In training camp, soldiers spent more time practicing classic army maneuvers and making beds than learning how to fight in Vietnam. This lack of preparation became evident quickly. James Brown was conscripted into the war. Although the U.S. does not have compulsory service, people can be drafted during times of conflict. Most of the soldiers drafted for Vietnam were young men aged 18 to 20 who had not attended college or had influential parents or jobs. However, not everyone who was eligible for the draft was sent to Vietnam, as conscription was partial. For instance, in 1969, a conscription lottery was held where potential recruits were grouped and assigned numbers from 1 to 365 according to their birthdays. Then, the groups were conscripted in order, rejecting unsuitable candidates and students. Ultimately, before the idea was declared a failure, the draft lottery number reached 169. Nonetheless, the issues with mandatory conscription were minor. Soldiers were going to Vietnam voluntarily, and only a third of them were drafted. To illustrate the level of patriotism, we could look at World War II, where the situation was the opposite. Only a third of soldiers were volunteers. Regarding our protagonist, James, even when he was drafted, he was not upset. Thanks to propaganda, every American believed they were going to Vietnam to fight communism, not a hypothetical enemy. Millions were prepared to give their lives for that cause. So when Brown went to the recruiting office, he was not concerned. He was given the latest technology, underwent a brief training session, and was sent to Vietnam by plane. The conditions on paper did not seem bad. Even a draftee could leave after 1 year of service, and enlisted soldiers were paid $78 per month. In today's money, that's equivalent to around $1,000. Considering that food, water, and lodging were provided for free in the Army, it doesn't seem like such a bad deal, does it? Unfortunately, the reality was quite different. Once he arrived in Vietnam, Brown immediately experienced the horrors of war. He was assigned as a machine gunner in the infantry corps guarding the border between Saigon and Vietnam. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam during those years, and as you can imagine, a sweet target for North Vietnam. So, in spite of the relatively distant location of the front, Brown did not have it easy. Constant ambushes, guerrilla warfare, and taunts, even from civilians, instantly dampened James's romantic fervor. But what besieged him even more was the structure of the army in Vietnam. The U.S. generals didn't care about the morality of soldiers, and if a soldier was killed, they would simply send a new one to take their place using the leftover principle. This meant that James was already placed in an experienced team, often in the place of a deceased comrade. It's not difficult to guess that the morale of the squad was not at its best, which was underscored by the horrors that were happening all the time. A typical day for Brown could look like this. The team would load up in a helicopter and fly to the area where the target was located based on intelligence. Often, the target turned out to be a village with civilians. Soldiers, who were initially relaxed, would offer chocolates to children running towards them, only to be blown up by grenades. Situations like this were all too common in Vietnam. Mothers quietly mined their own children, and sometimes suddenly pulled out their own machine guns to shoot the soldiers. As we mentioned in our video, US intervention forced many Vietnamese residents to switch to the north side, and coupled with a well-developed guerrilla system, death could catch James anywhere. Several facts emerge from this at once. The first is the brutality of the war. After just a few months, soldiers began following the rule formulated by Nick Turse: kill everything that moves. Exhausted by constant attacks from civilians, soldiers often fired on innocent people, killed children, and bombed entire villages simply because they thought there were guerrillas there. This situation is barbaric, but it has an explanation. James, like all soldiers in Vietnam, was broken. According to statistics, 1 in 10 Americans died, and 99% of the time it was not a fair fight. The Viet Cong used everything at their disposal, including traps, mines, and ambushes from civilians, to win the battle. The Americans were quickly demoralized, and they responded to the deaths of their comrades with the same brutality. The clearest example of this American ruthlessness is the village of Sun Mai. On March 16, 1968, 500 civilians were killed by the U.S. military. Among them were 173 children and 182 women. The reason given was that someone thought the village was cooperating with the guerrillas, but details and plots were erased by mutually exclusive indicators. What emerged was a terrible war crime, for which only one lieutenant was officially convicted, and he was pardoned the next day by a personal decree of the president. This perfectly illustrates the message of the American generals. They were not just against killing civilians, they encouraged it, but not because of their own cruelty, but because of the danger of riots and the unstable situation. In the U.S. itself, as you know, many demanded an end to the war, and our Brown and other soldiers, after a month in Vietnam, had little understanding of what they were fighting for or against. Their days were colored only by the deaths of friends, and there was no end in sight. Drugs kept Americans from deserting, with nearly 1 in 2 soldiers using them. One nurse who worked in Vietnam for a year said that even the orderlies were constantly high, let alone the soldiers. The orderlies themselves were going crazy from the number of wounded and understood how the soldiers felt. Therefore, morphine, opium, and hallucinogens were prescribed to soldiers, even when they were not needed. And concurrently, the black market thrived. James is well aware of the prices. A week's supply of opium costs $1, morphine is $5, and a packet of hallucinogenic pills costs $4. Even officers didn't forbid soldiers from taking drugs while on duty. As you may recall, a private's pay was $78, which increased to $83 after 4 months of service. So drugs were affordable for everyone. There were even rumors that the pills enhanced vision and hearing, instilling confidence in their abilities. As a result, the U.S. Army became a den of drug addicts, and the stories were appalling. For example, a Chu Lai soldier killed a Vietnamese with a bayonet and then licked him clean. There were even shootouts in the rear, where drugged-up soldiers experienced flashbacks, took their weapons, and fired at their own people. Even if James is a good person, there is no guarantee that he won't crack. There are no clear enemies in Vietnam, and a civilian can be a guerrilla fighter. Friends die in groups, and survivors use drugs to commit unspeakable acts of violence against civilians. And the saddest part is that high-ranking officials encouraged it. Presidents and generals did nothing to curb it. On the contrary, killers of civilians were often given awards, and propaganda worked even at the front. James still believed that he was fighting communism rather than specific people. Add in some pills, and the typical military man in Vietnam becomes an aggressive semi-robot with a brainwashed mind. And often, not a particularly intelligent robot either, as the Defense Secretary McNamara officially lowered the requirements for conscripts in 1966 amid a shortage of soldiers. This was the so-called 100,000 Project, designed to enlist as many people as possible. It was assumed on paper that people who were not psychologically, mentally, or physically fit would be given an opportunity to enlist, learn, and earn money. In reality, the program turned out to be a disaster. The 150,000 people recruited through it were often uneducated, violent, and sometimes even illiterate. This is no joke. Among the so-called New Standard soldiers, 40% read worse than a middle schooler, and 50% had IQs below 85. These soldiers were commonly referred to as McNamara morons, and statistically, they performed worse in every aspect of their duties. They were more likely to be killed or desert, and sadly, they even killed their own officers and comrades in combat. In the end, the program was declared a failure, and mentions of it on the internet are hard to come by. But this did not make things any easier for our protagonist, James. He could have had a skilled and gifted soldier in his squad, but instead, his chances of survival were diminished by having to serve alongside these McNamara morons. What's even sadder is that if James Brown were to serve a year and return home, life would continue to be difficult for him. The U.S. was striking against the Vietnam War, and often veterans were beaten, despised, and hated. They received no honors or discounts, and peaceful life was almost more of a threat to them. These were people who had been through hell, drugs, death, and constant violence. Fortunately, most managed to cope. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans is only 1% higher than the general population, and even post-demobilization drug use statistics among them are no higher than usual. In fact, statistics show that 85% of veterans successfully landed jobs and faced no problems. So, if James were to return home, it is likely that he would be okay. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Vietnam. Soldiers fought for an average of 240 days out of 365, and the average age of the dead was under 23. The war was an embarrassment to the United States, but the way its veterans were able to adjust to civilian life deserves respect. Well, that's it for now. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and also suggest your ideas for future releases in the comments. See you soon, folks!